How are you?
I'm doing great, and I think you were kinder than I have been today on how interesting the move is. I mean, the move makes little to no sense to me for the Dolphins, and it's not because I don't believe Tua is going to be spectacular. I do, but you're right. They're right in the thick of this playoff hunt. I don't understand the move when you've got momentum, which is the hardest thing to get and the easiest thing to lose in 2020.
You bring that up, and again, this is a situation, too, as I'm watching where the Texans could possibly end up, and they have that Texans pick, that next year's first-round pick. I mean, I'm not saying that they're tanking because they weren't really good at tanking last year. They won too many games to get up to that number one spot. They almost gave up all their first-round draft picks. No, but I'm not saying that they're tanking, but is it one of those two where they're like, oh, man, we're not trying to win too many games this year. We could potentially end up with 2 top 10 picks in this upcoming first round.
Well, I'm not sure about that just because they spent so much money this offseason. Their secondary, particularly, like they went out and spent cash. I think the Dolphins thought they were going to be pretty good. I just don't think that they understood that the rest of the East wasn't going to be pretty good. I mean, it's easy to presume that the Patriots are going to fix everything. I'm not willing to just turn around and make that presumption quickly. The real question here becomes the Bills. And frankly, the Bills are 4-0 against, and then 0-2 against good teams, right? So, who are the Bills? Is Josh Allen sustainable the way he's playing? I mean, those are questions we don't know the answer to. And for Miami, if they think that they have a shot at the division or the shot at a wild card, which is going to be really tough to get in the AFC, I'm not sure you can afford even one game. And it's fair to say, hey, Tua could cost you a game. Even if he's great, he could cost you a game in the, sort of the process of becoming a pro quarterback. There's got to be an adjustment.
Yeah, you talk about Buffalo being versus upper echelon caliber teams. We can say the same thing about the Browns, right?
I mean, you're right about that. I mean, and by the way, Dan Graziano always tells me, use my words. He tells me meh and aren't words. I disagree, Dan. But
I disagree too.
You're absolutely. I look at the Browns particularly, and look, at some point you got to look at Baker, and we've talked about Baker together before. At some point you got to look at Baker and say, okay, the running game is strong for this team. The offensive line grades out incredibly well for this team. He has weapons to throw to for this team. So he's got an offensive-minded coach that's supposed to be very good. They're running the ball so effectively. Like, what's the problem? And at some point, the problem can only be everybody else for so long. I mean, Baker's got to be better. And I don't think that's a hot take. And I'm not saying he can't be better. It's just when he doesn't play well, he costs his team games. Not even the like middle of the road, okay, somehow I didn't play well, but we can still manage. No, when Baker doesn't play well, the Browns lose. And so he's got to fix that. Like, all he has to do is not stink, and the Browns should be pretty good. The problem is sometimes Baker just goes out and lays an egg, and that's not something you can get used to for the fan base.
At a certain point, and again, Kevin Stefanski's come out and announced that, look, if he's healthy, he's the starter moving forward. Obviously, I don't think we're at the point yet where we're heavily talking about QB controversy there, but obviously going out and getting Case Keenum in the offseason. I remember when they signed him to a 3-year deal, and he's one of the highest paid backup quarterbacks in the league. And I remember pointing out then that said a lot about what the front office was kind of viewing big picture with Baker, is that you go around, no team out there signs backup quarterbacks for 3 years. And really, there's not a lot of quarterbacks out there that look to sign to be a backup for 3 years. I felt there was conversations behind closed doors saying, hey, there's a pretty good shot that Keenum could be the starter before it's all said and done by the end of this year. At what point, if this team continues to lose like they did yesterday, if they face another game like that where they have to say, hey, we have too much talent, we can't afford to waste all this talent just trying to force a square peg into a round hole, talking about Baker Mayfield?
Man, everything you've said makes 1,000% sense, and the answer would be in the next couple of weeks. It's just hard for me to wrap my head around Baker being given up on. And that's just a complete, I'll be the first to admit it, it's a complete brand bias to who I think we all think Baker was going to be, or thought Baker had the opportunity to be. I don't know that I ever looked at Baker and said, okay, he's going to be the next whatever, Dan Marino, right? But I still looked at Baker and thought, yeah, I mean, they got themselves a good quarterback. The thought that we're even having this conversation shows you that at this point it's failing. And I don't know how Kevin Stefanski fixes it. So then you got to look at it and say, okay, how long are you willing to go before you have to eventually throw it out? Because at some point, this is still a good enough Browns team to win a bunch of games. Like, if he's a liability, you got to move on, but you don't get to get that moment back. Like, the minute they bench Baker, I don't see how they ever get it back with him. So that would be sort of admitting that they made a mistake with the pick. And that's just tough to do 3 years in.
You want to talk about the Cincinnati Bengals and young Joe Burrow and these close matchups that he's had, threw the interception this past week with the Colts. He had the tie with Philadelphia, and then obviously the missed kick in the opening week versus the Chargers and everything like that. Is it too early on Joe Burrow to say he can't get it done in the clutch?
Yeah, I think it is because, let's face it, as we talked about before, I don't think his receivers helped him at all in the first one. And, when a kicker misses an easy kick, that's not on him. I think that there's been times that he's been failed by everybody else. But the one thing we have said is that he can't let Cincinnati impact him. He's got to impact Cincinnati. That throw was not Joe Burrow. Like, that is just, I know it's one throw and there's a lot of throws in the game, but that interception was a moment where I looked at it and thought, man, that is not the Joe Burrow that I expect. That's not the Joe Burrow that he expects. That's not the Joe Burrow that the Bengals demand. I mean, that's not the throw to make in that situation. You cannot place the ball that high and outside of the reach the way he did. It cost him the game, and that's a moment where it feels like a little bit of Cincinnati seeps into Joe Burrow. He's got to come back strong from that because I think you've got to sort of reverse those tendencies, and that's going to take him playing really aggressively and really well.
One more thing about the Cincinnati Bengals, Randy Bullock. Obviously, he missed a kick in opening week versus the Chargers, but he also missed another kick this past weekend. I'm not a guy that says, oh, man, these guys need to be losing their job, man. But I don't understand, kickers, lose their jobs left and right in this league, man. I don't see how he's still employed with the Cincinnati Bengals.
Yeah, I actually agree with you on that a lot. And I do think if there's any one spot that just comes with the territory, it's for kickers, right? I mean, that's just a level of what we expect. And frankly, shouldn't we sort of demand that? Like, being a kicker means that you are living in constant pressure, right? So if you're constantly being pressured, then in my mind, the pressure of having to make the kicks to keep your job is just part of that life. I'm with you. I mean, it can't be that hard to find kickers, but it feels like it is, man. It's the number of teams that have bad kickers is just, it's inexcusable to me. Like, where are all the good kickers? They all play in soccer now. Is everybody giving up on just place kicking? A ton of money in it. Go out and get it figured out.
ESPN Radio's Jason Fitz with us here on the Justin Kinder Show with Kev Nash on Dayton's ESPN Radio Station 1410 Wing AM. To go back to that Browns-Steelers game, I'm done talking about the Browns. Forget the Browns. The narrative was that the Browns were really bad, obviously, but I think that takes away from how good Pittsburgh played as well, because we could talk about how bad the Browns played and how bad Baker played, but the one strength about the Browns that we talked about was their run game. That offensive line is one of the best in football, and Pittsburgh's front four, or their front line, they absolutely demolished that offensive line for Cleveland. They physically made Cleveland look like they had no business being in that game. How good's Pittsburgh? Was that the game that you look at now and say, okay, even if it was Cleveland, that's the game that you looked at and said they put it all together? We saw dominant performance offensively and defensively.
Yeah, I 1,000%. And look, a few weeks ago when Kansas City beat Baltimore, at the time I said that was less a statement of Baltimore, more statement Kansas City. I do think that this game's a little statement on Cleveland, but it's also a big statement on the Steelers. And I don't know why people are really surprised by that. Like, I came into the season saying, hey, last year, had there been 7 playoff teams in each conference, they would have made the playoffs. And that was with people we've never heard of playing quarterback, right? Just getting Big Ben back was going to be enough to put them into that conversation. I mean, yeah, if you're winning games with Duck, you're doing better than most of the NFL.
Myles Garrett made Mason Rudolph famous last year, so
you are right about that.
I nailed that one on the head, didn't I?
I'm looking at this and I'm saying, man, this is simple. The Steelers are great. They're not good. They're great. The problem is Kansas City is still the best team in the NFL to me. So it's funny because Steelers fans became so angry at Mike Tomlin in one era for not winning a Super Bowl without acknowledging that they were up against, that epic moment of the Patriots every year. Well, this year, I think the Steelers could be the best team in the NFL. The problem is they're up against the Chiefs, and the Chiefs are just a juggernaut.
All right, Jason, we'll send you out with this. I know we talked a lot of NFL, but I have a question about the Ohio State Buckeyes out of the Big Ten. The Big Ten finally kicks off their season this week, a month and a half after everyone else has. But they're only playing 8 games this year, and we just saw with Florida and we just saw with LSU how they had the luxury of being able to push back a big game and postpone it. Ohio State, you only get 8 weeks. You only get 8 games, and 8 games is still less than what the SEC, ACC, and others are playing. So I'm curious with this circumstance right here. Ohio State's undefeated at the end of the year, but they had to cancel a game due to an outbreak, whether it's their team or not. How can you put them in a college football playoff at 7-0 if everyone else has 10 or 11 games on their resume? Do you see a scenario that could present itself and be a real issue come playoff time?
The only reason I'd say no is because the body of work that we've gotten so far from the rest of the teams in college football has made most of them look really foolish. Like the number of teams that have looked bad right now. I mean, we were doing it on one of the digital college football shows I hosted. The big conversation was who's the fifth best team in the country right now? And that's not an easy question to answer when you start looking around and saying, well, who really belongs in the playoff? Like, I think the fact that we haven't seen the Big Ten is actually right now helping Ohio State, Penn State, Wisconsin, three teams that have high expectations coming in. So it all comes down to that Ohio State game at night, Happy Valley against Penn State. I think if that's an epic game, the Big Ten has a real shot at getting two teams in the playoffs, even if they play less games, because what we've seen from Georgia and Georgia against Bama wasn't good enough. It doesn't matter how you shake it out. It wasn't good enough. And Notre Dame and North Carolina do not pass the eye test, and the eye test is everything to the committee. So I expect, knowing that there's limitations on how many games the Big Ten can play, I think Ohio State's going to come out from day one trying to run it up on everybody and just remind everybody, it doesn't matter how many games we played, we won by 1,000 points a week, and that's going to be a big initiative for them. So I think it actually, in that sense, that's why they'll still be in, because they're going to kill everybody along the way.
You know, something I've been talking to Kenner about, you know, how sloppy college football has looked, it really hasn't looked good, is because these teams really didn't get that much practice time. But on the hindsight, the Big Ten has been practicing forever. So do you think the Big Ten teams will come out playing better football as opposed to the SEC and the Big 12 and ACC when they started playing?
They should. I mean, they should. But the one thing I would say about that is that I expected the SEC to look better than the Big 12, especially defensively. And I don't know why everybody keeps telling me, like, I've asked every analyst why we're holding SEC defense to a different standard than Big 12. And everybody keeps saying, well, it's different. It's different. No, I mean, these defenses have been awful so far this year. And I'm not going to make an exception just because they happen to wear Alabama jerseys instead of Oklahoma.
Means more.
So, I mean, yeah, well, maybe playing defense should mean something to the SEC because it's been bad so far. So, you know, I think the Big Ten should come out and look cleaner. But the one thing I'd say is that the committee is going to expect that. And that's one thing that is, I mean, unfair in this process, is the committee is going to hold them to a different standard because they have had more time. So they're going to expect cleaner football from Ohio State than they've expected from Alabama. I don't think it's right. I just think it's human nature to what they're going to do.
All right, ESPN Radio's Jason Fitz, Spain and Fitz, weeknights from 7 to 9 p.m. right here on 1410 ESPN Radio. You can hear Jason coming up later on tonight. Jason, thanks so much for your time. We look forward to this every week. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a great week.
You too. All right, 457-94.